Welcome to this presentation on the Universal Peace Federation, UPF, which is in many ways the top or the summit of the peace efforts of unificationism. Of course, there's no intent to say that it's better or more important or whatever, but the fact is that it's the one that somehow brings together or is meant to bring together all other efforts towards peace. And the main organization, especially in that field, next to the Family Federation, which is the strictly religious element and central element of unificationism. So, as you can see, it was founded by Reverend Moon. He was still alive then. And I will, as the subtitle here indicates, speak about the mission of UPF and give some considerations. I will not explain everything about it. They have a wonderful website. Some pages are still from the old, rather outdated website, but the main part of the new website is beautiful. And the content, regardless of what it looks like, is there's so much about so many things that it's really something you can dive into repeatedly and you can always discover something new. The main topic within this topic of UPF is its relationship to the United Nations. We have already seen the United Nations a lot of times because it's central to the birth of peace studies, and it's been a constant reference in many weeks in this course as well as in the Peace and Conflict Studies course. But here we have something new. In 1998, Reverend Moon said, if the UN does not listen to us, I will make an able-type UN. In other words, for the first time, there was a proposition, a proposal to replace the UN. Now, maybe, and I can imagine some individuals somewhere in the world probably already thought of that. There's always somebody who thinks, I can take on the world, but it's a pretty big thing. And to do it in a credible way is an even bigger thing. To say, well, the UN, which is all countries coming together and become members of this world body, I can replace that, or we can replace that. If they don't understand, if they don't listen, we'll replace them. That's a big thing to do. And yeah, you better have something behind that statement if you want to look credible. In any case, as we know, our true parents have this consciousness of who they are, and they never hesitate to make statements that can be shocking or sound grandiose. Because they have the awareness and the sense that they speak for God, God who wants to retake ownership of his world, which means, of course, that any association of countries, no matter how many there are, is very small compared to that. So let us now go a little bit into the specifics. What led our founders to announce that the UN might have to be replaced by something that will have to be created, and that was later created. Well, before the main one, which is UPF, was created, there have been precedents, and I cannot go into that. It's fascinating, but it would be a course on history, the history of the unification movement. It's there. There is a book by Dr. Meckler, and there are many also documents on that, but that's not the purpose today. Just briefly, right after the end of the Cold War in 1990, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, after the meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev and the year after with Kim Il-sung, there was the sense that now we, not just for us, but the world had a sense now we can make a new beginning, and we can make this new beginning together, not against each other. So that sense was very strong. And there was indeed a new openness that included all countries in the world, with a few small exceptions like Cuba at that time, Russia, which was open, democratic, and even China, which, as you remember, until Tiananmen was opening and where we had quite a few activities. So at that time, uh, our parents founded a Federation for World Peace, initially International Federation for World Peace, and an Interreligious Federation for World Peace. Mind, body, easy to, or body and mind, easy to understand. And that was the very foundation to create something that can bring the world together on a deeper level than the United Nations did, and that would lead to more in the future. I remember in 1990 or 91 in Kosovo, I was using forms that asked people to essentially become members and to support the International Federation for World Peace. I gave them to sign to many professors. The first president of Kosovo, Ibrahim Rugova, signed it. And this was essentially very symbolic. There was maybe not much to it, except that many, a number of these people then became involved with us, became friends, and so on. So it was a starting point. Then, a little later, both were brought together as one, the Interreligious and International Federation for World Peace. And you can see that on the left, you have form, an ambassador for peace appointment form or certificate that has this logo. It has the logo on the left is another, it's almost the UPF logo, but slightly different. And the IFWP, International Interreligious and International Federation for World Peace. So that preceded, Ambassadors for Peace preceded UPF, strictly speaking, even though it was in the making. And then in between the one in the middle with this pink cross, which symbolizes it's religious and international as well. And you can also see that all the symbolism that you have on the right in the UPF logo are already there. And actually, I like it better than the UPF logo. And on the right, it's called Interreligious and International Peace Council. So it was supposed to be more than just a federation. And then this never developed into much of anything. Then very quickly, Trupans went on to create the Universal Peace Federation in 2005. Here is a quote from Champoumogyong. By means of forming the Parents' UN, the Women's UN, the UN of Religions, Youth UN, and Students UN, we are creating the form of a nation and are preparing the structure that will take us to the world of peace. So in this short sentence here, you have a lot. It speaks of basically the parents, men, women, and children, youth, and students that supposed to form basically a group of organizations that represent humankind in all its forms, in all it represents under God, that as such represents the form of a nation. In other words, it should be a nation, but it was not possible. For a long time, Trupans have tried to form a nation, a place where their ideal can be realized concretely, specifically Korea. But it didn't work. It was not early. It was too early. very clearly not feasible. So Trupans created the form of a nation, something that can temporarily take the place of a nation. And for that, you need various elements. You need people, you need sovereignty, etc. This has been, to me, it shows the desperation of our true parents to create something for God before they themselves go to spirit world, being aware that foundation was not there, but we need to do something, no matter how difficult it is. So that was the goal. And then once you have that, then you can bring world peace to it. You can see already the almost dilemma. We don't have a nation, but we have to do something like a nation, take that place, and then conquer the world level without being members of the UN ourselves, because we are not a nation. So already the idea of a separate entity, the new UN, is there. That was in 1999. Now, when you speak of a new UN and you call it the able UN, then automatically that implies that there is a Kane UN. It's not just, it's logical thinking, even if Reverend Moon and Dr. Hakshahan had never mentioned that Kane UN by name, it would be obvious. You don't have able without Kane. So I read, now, however, it is entirely possible for the Universal Peace Federation to fulfill its mission to unite heaven and earth and form the kingdom of a peaceful, ideal world. When I hear or read, it is entirely possible, that reminds me, for the United Nations, it has never been possible. That is because it represents God's victory and the fruit of true parents' blood, sweat, and tears. Therefore, the Universal Peace Federation is the world's cherished hope, even though the world is not aware of what that cherished hope is or looks like, but the hope is there. It will carry out the role of an able type counterpart to the existing Kane type United Nations, to renew the UN and provide the leadership for a new sovereignty of universal peace known in Korean as Chan Il-guk, the kingdom of God on earth. In other words, not something that comes after we die, but something that we have to build. But we have to build it because that's what God wanted humankind to build from the beginning, not just because somebody has the idea to do it. That was 2006. So it's a very optimistic tone that shows the foundation for this after the end of the Cold War and after many other things that I cannot elaborate on. That foundation was there. It was feasible. But we know from experience that feasible or entirely possible can still mean incredibly difficult and very likely not to work the way it was expected to work. Now, does UPF, in Trupans' eyes, replace the United Nations, or does it work with the United Nations? When you say Kane and able, then if it's the able UN, then you will assume that there's a relationship between the able UN and the Kane UN, not that the Kane UN is just eliminated, because then we have something completely new. There's no more Kane and able. The new one replaces the old one. Or the third option, which was actually the first option, was to work within the UN. So there's only one UN, but we stimulate it and revive it from inside. That was, of course, the first thing that was attempted. And we'll now see how we moved step by step from working inside the UN with the UN, and to finally, at least to some extent, working separately. As I write here, the UN is still very much present in UPF. And I don't mean just that UPF works at the UN, it's an NGO and all that. But even if you look at the website of UPF, and I'm not sure this page may have been changed, renewed, at least the looks of it. But when you look, all our organizations, not just UPF, have the 17 sustainable development goals everywhere. It's like sometimes almost obsessive. And then, of course, one of the key people we have been working with, not just at UN, but in general, is Ban Ki-moon. And the connections between UPF and the United Nations are too many to count. It's very strong. We are very strong present as the UN, and the UN is a very strong presence, at least in our mind and in what we are doing. So clearly, and that is until today. So clearly, to answer that in advance, the UN has never been completely discarded. And it's very simple. Why? Because creating something that can literally replace the United Nations would mean, I mean, you have to recreate everything. Plus, you have to find even one nation who wants to work with you rather than with you. And the task is almost it's almost undoable. However, we can develop separately something like UPF that becomes bigger and bigger and more important and a more important and significant, influential element within the UN as an NGO, and then bringing together other NGOs that finally merges somehow with the United Nations by changing it. So there's always this idea of renewing the United Nations. It's never clear cut this and then we give up and we do that. So that I wanted to indicate to begin with, that even though the idea is now we are the AWN, now it's happening really with us, that is continued. Also, the United Nations is still the only world body, plus its related organizations, that has the means, the structure, the people, the funding, everything that it takes to create really something worldwide that can lead to world peace, a secretariat, a headquarter building, so many things. Replacing that is very difficult to imagine. Now, a few key steps. Again, I'm going very fast. Assembly 2000, renewing the United Nations to build lasting peace, is a big event that took place at the United Nations in 2000, of course, and with a name that clearly indicates that at that time, the idea was still to renew the United Nations from within, not replacing it. That event was sponsored by primarily the Philippines, the Indonesia. We had a very good relationship with the former president of Indonesia. Primarily Indonesia, and then 3 other nations joined. And it had the presence of very high-level people, Kenneth Kaunda, probably the most famous former head of state in Africa, Edward Heath, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Oscar Arias, former President of Costa Rica, but also Nobel laureate for peace, Bob Dole, who had been candidate for president, Republican candidate for president, and defeated by Bill Clinton, and quite a few others. And I remember I was there in the public, and I remember that Bob Dole, who had been the person behind the persecution that led finally to Reverend Moon going to jail, so to speak, an arch enemy of ours. Then he became, candidate for president. It didn't work out, and he ended up coming to us. And in a stunning turn of events, when he was speaking, each one stood up and made a speech. When he made his speech, at some point he made some kind of a joke, half joke. Difficult to say how much it was joke and how much it was meant seriously. He said, well, now basically I'm unemployed, because he had ended his political career. I'm unemployed, so if you have something if you have a job for me, I'll be very much interested. He didn't get the job, but I remember feeling how quickly these things can change. He started as an enemy. He became a friend. I mean, supporting us, and then even begging us for a job publicly. Um, anyway, so that was kind of a high point leading to our work at the United Nations on a much higher level than before. At the same meeting, there was a key proposal made by Reverend Moon. Dr. Meckler, who wrote one of the articles that you will read, says there were three things that Reverend Moon really wanted, and one was an interreligious council at the United Nations. Another one was the question of the family, and a third one was to have peace parks. That was just an idea. I cannot show pictures because it never happened. Part of the international highway, a peace park between between North and South Korea, the DMZ, to transform that into a peace park. That was actually an idea that already Kenneth Boulding had in the early days of peace studies, for those who remember that. Because these ideas, they're never completely new. There's always an antecedent. They become really important once somebody can grab them solidly and fully understand their implications and how they can be actualized in fact, and is behind them and make them really alive. But you can always find somebody who had similar ideas before because these needs exist. So anyway, these were the three things that Reverend Moon really wanted to do. Now, at the same time, the title here is Turning Point, because that became also the first disappointment. The Interreligious Council was meant to be like, the Senate and the House of Representatives, the two chambers within the United Nations, one being the one where each nation has a representative, but they usually think of nothing else and even insist on the right of their nation, as we know, from experience and from what we heard. And another one should be there, that's the interreligious, in other words, a group of representatives from all religions. You already know that, so I can skip. What is not clear is that there is always behind that a lot of effort. For instance, to go back to the Peace Park, Reverend Moon had acquired in South America a vast surface of land in several countries. We still have them. And he offered them to the governments to give up part of their sovereignty. So it's not just, why don't you make a peace park? But hey, I compensate you for that. So it's not just words. And with the Interreligious Council, there was the awareness that the way religions are now, they are in a way more likely to fight each other even worse than the national representatives in the General Assembly. So there was a great effort made for interreligious harmony and interfaith work that started in the 70s with UTS and even before that. My mom was involved with the New Ecumenical Research Association, New Era, already in the 70s. So again, it's not just an idea, but there has been a concerted effort to prepare the world of religions for that. Were they ready? I think not, but not less than the political leaders are ready. Just an effort was made, and the proposal then was not just an empty proposal. There was some kind of some substance behind it, as much as feasible. And this was taken up by the nations of the Philippines this time. And we had a very close friend who just passed away 2 or 3 months ago, I believe, or maybe a little more. Time passes quickly. The speaker, Jose de Venecia, He was the Speaker of the House for a long time of the Philippines, and he became a very close friend with our two parents and with our movement in general. He received the blessing. He was close, very close, and really pushed for that. And he pushed the Philippine president at that time to ask the General Assembly, to ask the United Nations to create such a, to make such a proposal, to create a second assembly of religious people. And the Philippines did it. So all good so far. But then very quickly, the Philippine government just took it over for itself. And when the project was finally made and it went through several, it was not just one time, it went from one year to the next in 2005, 2006. It had several iterations, and UPF was not even mentioned. As it said, the Philippines UN delegation effectively excluded the unification movement representatives from any participation in the resolution. So we gave the idea, we encouraged them through their man, De Venecia, and they started doing it, but then they completely forgot about us, intentionally, and ignored IIFWP and UPF work through its resolution, though its resolutions cited numerous lesser activities. That means when they made those proposals in detail, they mentioned a lot of other groups that were interested in that, but they don't even mention us, because obviously also we sometimes were, or not just sometimes, we were considered um, challenging, a challenging group to be with. People say controversial. And so that's the way it went. So in other words, even though the proposal was made, it never led to anything, but we were excluded, which means that Reverend Moon's conclusion was we have to do it ourselves. The second turning point is the marriage blessing. As I mentioned, there was the idea to create a Parents' Day at the UN. In the United States, it happened with a Republican Congress, but a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, not the most qualified to have something about the family, to do something about the family, but anyway, he did. So it's an official holiday now in the United States. At the United Nations, there was resistance, even though there was also support. Many nations supported it. But anyway, then to emphasize the role of not just parents, but the family, Reverend Moon did the unthinkable. It was unthinkable at the United Nations, and he knew it, of course. He held a blessing, a mass wedding at the United Nations. You see it right here on the right in that picture. And on the left is the blessing being given by two parents. Two parents in Korean dress, and every participant was wearing their national costume. That didn't sit well with the United Nations. I was there. It was incredible. I was, not dreaming like you had drunk a beer or two. You felt like, what's going on? This is getting more and more amazing. There was a strong pushback because religion, and especially this was not just supporting the family, but this was a religious act of the family, of the Unification Church, or Family Federation by then. So none of our organizations were ejected from the United Nations, but for a while it made it very difficult for us to be active at the United Nations. We were there, but somehow very low key, and we had difficulties doing this and that. And in particular, if you remember, the Parent Federation, and then the Women's Federation, also the Young People's Federation. So that federation was created, Youth Federation, and it applied to become like the others, an NGO at United Nations. That application was rejected. So that was kind of a turning point again. Well, we can't do it here at United Nations. Now you can say, well, Reverend Moon was crazy to do that. He shouldn't have. But you have to also understand that without doing that, nothing would have happened. We could stay, but nothing would have happened. And that is basically what revolutionaries do always. They do things that seem crazy. When it doesn't work, what remains is that was a crazy thing to do. When it works, wow, that was a stroke of genius. And that was an incredible pioneering effort. So that was the second uh, reason why essentially I work with the United Nations within and also uh, evaporated. And then led to the second stage and finally third stage to work with the United Nations as the able United Nations.